Welcome to the How HR Leaders Change the World podcast. I'm your host, Cecilia Crossley, and each week we explore how the work of HR leaders is also creating positive social change, contributing to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Goals which the world's companies are increasingly understanding the urgency of achieving and investing in the action required. If you'd like clear, actionable ideas for how you can use the power of your role to affect change in your company, you're in the right place. Following a corporate upbringing, I founded the social enterprise From Babies with Love. We provide services to HR leaders, and through this work, I realised that HR professionals and social entrepreneurs are working in the same areas, albeit in different ways. So we created this podcast to share knowledge on steps we can take through the work of HR. In my opinion, if you're an HR professional, you are also a change maker. And this podcast will provide you with examples of how. By sharing the successes of some of the world's most inspiring HR leaders, you can frame your work in the context of positive change, implement brilliant ideas, and feel absolutely wonderful about doing so. A very warm welcome to Chris Parsons to How HR Leaders Change the World. Chris, it's wonderful to feature you here on the podcast. I'm particularly interested to hear your thoughts and learn from you, given your senior leadership role at Herbert Freehills, knowing that you are by profession a lawyer, but having held such senior roles for such a long time, of course, you are also a people leader, and you have a particular interest in mental wellbeing, which I know is going to be fascinating for our listeners. So thank you so much for joining us. And may I ask you just to briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Cecilia. I have been at the same firm, the one that you mentioned, Herbert Freehills, all of my career, and which is now over 36 years. And I've been fortunate to work in lots of different bits of the world, in London, in Italy, in Singapore, and in Hong Kong. And then for the last 16 years, I've been focused on India as chairman of our India practice.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I always love to include or to amplify global perspectives on this podcast. And so your wealth of experience across those cultures and regions is going to add even more fascinating examples to the thoughts you share today, I'm sure. And so our 5 questions that we ask are very much tailored to the work of people leadership. And I'm just going to rephrase them slightly in that I won't describe you exactly as an HR leader in terms of, a career-long HR professional, but, as a leader whose influence is creating social change, what do you feel has been your most impactful action to date?
Yeah, well, look, in a way, it's odd, I think, what I'm going to share, in the sense that you'd think perhaps in terms of my role as a lawyer, it might have been in building teams to advise on cross-border transactions around the world. But actually, I think probably my biggest impact has been in coming out in 2015 to talk about my struggles with mental health, and in particular, issues around stress, anxiety, depression, and then the related issue of alcoholism. For many years, I self-medicated the anxiety and stress that I was feeling on a day-to-day basis. And I was encouraged by our then head of diversity to record what has become known as This Is Me video. And I think it was an initiative of the Lord Mayor of London, when he asked firms in the city to see if their employees would be willing to share a short video about their struggles with mental ill health. And so I was one of the first group that was willing to do so within HSF. My wife, I have to say, was slightly more reluctant than I was about me sharing my story. But having done it, and it was then shown to all 6,000 people within the firm, I realized that actually I could have a really big impact by sharing details of the struggles that I had suffered from, in the hope that I would be able to help the reduction of stigma around mental ill health in the workplace. And in fact, that seems to be what happened in practice. And actually, once I'd gone public and was slightly nervous about that first act of doing so, I then almost couldn't be held back. And I was happy then to talk more broadly about my challenges, both within the firm itself, but also more broadly around the world. And so I've spent a lot of time talking about my challenges, talking about what organizations can do to improve the lives of employees, and about how each of us can look after ourselves better. And I've done that, in the UK, in India, in Japan, in Australia, in Singapore, etc. And it's been something that has brought a real purpose, or an additional purpose, to me in my work, and I hope that it has helped various people who've heard what I've had to say on the topic.
And thank you so much for your openness and sharing your personal experience with us today. And I was wondering, for our listeners who might have programs of work in this area, in their own goals and objectives, are there any particular tools or practices that, in all that experience you have in different regions of the world, would be your top ones, the ones you consider most effective that can cross the kind of countries you mentioned have some really different cultures? If you were to begin a program of work in a brand new company, what would be the ones you would be most keen to implement, knowing their effectiveness?
Yeah, so there are two aspects to this. One is about what the organization itself can do and the culture it can create. And I've looked at that almost in groups, a sort of pillars of three. So the first one is, I talk about culture, and it's creating a culture of openness around mental well-being, recognizing that it's incredibly common and that people should be encouraged to talk about their challenges with mental well-being in the same way that they would talk about being physically ill and needing to take time off work. So there's a really important piece around culture, openness, about understanding, and about giving people time to recover and get better if they're not in a good place. The second pillar I talk about is one of prevention, and that's what an organization can do itself to proactively make life better for people. And so some examples there that I would mention would be training people on how to use technology sensibly. I know we can all get completely obsessed by our iPhones and what's on them and what we can access through them. But of course, they can also make us unwell if we spend too much time on them and become too obsessed with them. And so we have a very good course within HSF that helps people think about using their iPhones or other technology sensibly. For me, I actually have my phone on silent pretty much all the time. Which means that I'm not halfway through a podcast like this, or halfway through a meeting, or halfway through a dinner or a lunch, and my phone's going and I'm being interrupted and I'm wondering, who might be after me. So that's one thing I do. And the second thing I do is I have all of my notifications turned off. So again, I'm not looking and finding that, my WhatsApp's gone off, or I've got, another 10 emails have arrived and things. So I choose when to use the technology that I've got, and that's something that helps me. And then the third aspect is around if people do find themselves in a difficult place, is what's available within the organization to look after them. So do people understand it's important to go and see your GP if you're not feeling well from a mental health perspective? Do they understand the role of a psychiatrist? Do they understand the role of a counselor? Do they is there a really good employee assistance program that people can access, etc.? So there are a whole bunch of things under culture, under prevention and under cure, ideally, that I think organizations can bring to bear to help individuals. So that's from an organizational point of view. And then there's a separate piece around how can we look after ourselves better? How do we conduct our day-to-day lives that gives us the best chance of remaining both physically and mentally healthy? And I guess my two top tips on that would be one, exercise. I think exercise is incredibly important. Having given up alcohol, my only drug of choice at the moment, apart from caffeine, is endorphins that you get from exercise, and that certainly helps me to stay well. And the second one, and I'm happy to bore people to death on the topic of sleep, the importance of sleep. And I recommend that everyone should read the wonderful book by Professor Matthew Walker on why we sleep. And that gives you an insight that I certainly didn't have before around the importance of sleep. And I promise anybody who reads that book will never think of sleep in the same way again, and will not think of it as a nice to have, but recognize that it plays a critical importance in our sort of day-to-day healthy existence, whether it's just generally living or working.
Yeah, I absolutely love that book. And do you know what it did for me in terms of what you were saying about never be the same again? For me, it relieved a huge amount of maternal guilt that I was carrying around with me, not really perhaps consciously, but I was, in that I couldn't seem to remember my children as babies. Obviously, I've got photos of them and that assists your memory, but actual real memories. And I was like, what's wrong with me? What was I thinking about? What was I thinking about? Work too much? Why wasn't I paying attention? And why can't I remember my children as babies? And I realize now it's because I didn't sleep. And therefore I didn't form memories, because that's part of why we sleep. And so I'm like, oh, it's not me. It's literally the chemical processes couldn't take place because my sleep was so disrupted. I don't need to feel guilty. I'm not a bad parent, So it's just one little anecdote of how much I love that book. But
yeah, well, there was I think he gives an example that is very relevant to what you've said. I think there were two groups of people, two groups of students. One group was kept awake all night and then taught something. And the other group slept all night and was taught something. And it was extraordinary that the group who had slept all night had a 40% better recollection of what they'd been taught. So it is extraordinary, as you say, that memories and recall gets formed during the process of sleep.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the book recommendation, but also in particular, thank you for the 3 pillars that you set out in your approach to mental wellbeing in the workplace, because that's really useful for anybody listening today that is doing similar pieces of work for them to learn how you lead it at HSF. I'm moving on to our second question, which is to think more broadly about the legal profession. And in your role as a people leader at a law firm, what do you think is the most exciting opportunity for people leaders in law to change the world?
Yeah, and I think probably it's a lesson that's not just relevant to law, it's actually relevant more broadly. And it's so I sit on the board of a charity called MQ Mental Health Research, which is the leading mental health charity, research charity in the UK. And through that, I've met some wonderful people, and I've also been given access to some fascinating research, etc. And one of the things that I've learned is just how prevalent mental ill health is within the workplace. It's staggering to think that the biggest cause of disability today is mental ill health. I would never have thought that. It would never have occurred to me. And that's partly, I think, because the data isn't always terribly clear, because I think a lot of people would give an alternative reason for being off work rather than a mental health reason. And therefore, people haven't been able to track it so clearly. But there's been a lot of research done to really try and get underneath the data. And so, number one, mental ill health, biggest cause of disability in the world today. Even more worrying, it is thought that by 2040, depression on its own So if you exclude every other form of mental ill health, whether stress, anxiety, eating disorders, OCD, etc., but depression alone is thought to be, before too long, the biggest cause of disability in the world today. So you've got something that is incredibly common, that is awful. And having suffered from 5 serious episodes of depression during the course of my 36-year career, I know that it can also be life-threatening. And during each of those 5 episodes, it was the case that I wanted to go to sleep and not wake up, because life with depression was so awful. So you've got a situation where you've got something that's incredibly common in the workplace that is terrible and life-threatening. And so for me, I think that if we can, as leaders, as business leaders, as people leaders, as HR leaders, etc., can do more in this space to help people who are struggling with mental ill health, and ideally getting to a place where we're helping people before they're struggling or before they're struggling considerably, that would make an enormous impact in the world. And that is something that, in my own tiny way, I'm trying to make a difference.
How HR Leaders Change the World is brought to you by From Babies with Love, and this episode is sponsored by our very own parental leave gift service. We help solve the challenge of connecting with colleagues across parental leave and in returning to work, contributing to talent retention and so too gender balance strategy. From Babies with Love donates 100% of its profits to orphaned and abandoned children. Your beautiful, sustainably sourced From Babies with Love gifts come with the story of how your company is also helping a less fortunate child, creating meaningful engagement. We transform spend that so often already takes place on flowers or products that don't have the Sustainable Development Goals at their heart. We transform that spend to become a consistent, inclusive and strategic part of your working parents programme. Ask us to tell you more at frombabieswithlove.org. Make an impact at a defining moment. Yeah, and those statistics are they're rather overwhelming to hear the scale of the problem. And SDG, Sustainable Development Goal 3, is mental health and wellbeing. So, you know, it's a direct line to what you're saying about the impact that work in mental wellbeing and preventative measures can have for the well-being of the world. Mm-hmm. And in question 3, we ask about an area of social or environmental injustice that you're passionate about, and that you see that your role gives you a chance to create change. And you may well want to move on to something else that you're passionate about, but we can hear the passion in this area of mental wellbeing. So I was just wondering if we could just stay on that area, and in particular ask, in the work that you're doing within HSF and beyond, and in addressing the challenge that you just set out, looking forward to 2040 and the statistics you shared, what is it you would like to do next? And what do you feel that you're able to do as a leader in a law firm to, prevent those statistics from being realised?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of organisations, and this is not all by any means, have really moved the mental ill health issue closer to the top of the agenda, if not right to the top of the agenda. And certainly for me, I would like to see it moved close to, if not right at the top. So that's good and that's positive, but it's not true across the board, and it's not true across many geographies. And certainly, I spend a lot of time in India, and it's fair to say that the stigma around mental ill health and the people are very reluctant to talk about it in the workplace, and therefore I would love for there to be organisations in India and beyond where culturally it's less common to talk about these things for that to change. I'm conscious in particular in India that the family, the sort of broader family, plays an important role in this, partly in a very positive way, in that you have an extended family that are looking after each other, that are providing a strong social support. The downside of that is that often when people get unwell with a mental health issue, the family will say, please don't talk about this outside the family. It will bring shame on the family. Please, go to the temple and pray about it, do some yoga, do some meditation, it will pass. And the reality is that it doesn't always pass. And sometimes people will need to take separate help and care, including medication like antidepressants. So I think what I'm getting to is, one, I'd like there to be a much more focused effort to get organizations to really understand the importance of mental ill health and how it's impacting their organizations. It's almost a campaign of knowledge, of getting that out there. So that's the one thing. And then the second thing is that I think we need to do much, much more on the research front. And we're really only in the sort of gentle foothills, and we've got to scale Everest. And we are, literally in the sort of the grassy meadows at the moment. So little has been done on the on research into understanding what interventions might improve. And so MQ Mental Health Research have just started a program looking at workplace mental health and how research can support that. The Wellcome Trust, in conjunction with the World Economic Forum, has been doing some work, again, really in the foothills. So just to give an example, they've looked at 10 different areas of where there is underlying data to support interventions. And one of the interventions that they have been able to identify is that if we're on a Zoom call, we're doing meetings, etc., or we're at our computer, it is shown that if we can take a break every hour for about 5 minutes, even if all it is to get up, wandering around, walk to the kitchen and get a coffee, etc., that can reduce stress, anxiety, and depression by 15%. So there are there's some really interesting work that needs to be done to understand the underlying data, to give us the tools to enable us to say, these are the things we ought to be doing, and here's the support for them that can make a difference. And I hope that all those little bits of differences, there are some other examples around having a buddy system. So somebody joins an organization, they're given a buddy to look after them, to show them the ropes, to be their initial port of call. Again, this is shown to be a really effective way at bringing somebody into an organization in a way that is less stressful, that's less anxiety producing. So I think the next big step that I'd like to see happening is, one, around knowledge and sharing that knowledge more broadly about the importance of mental ill health, and then separately using data and research to indicate what interventions can be most effective.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you mentioned there your wish to see the topic of mental well-being on, and if not at the top, of leadership board, executive committees, agendas. And I was wondering how you found your experience of being part of such a board or committee in demonstrating to your peers why this needed to be at the top, perhaps without so much of that data and evidence, business case type information that you were just talking about. What would you recommend to anybody who may be struggling to engage or get buy-in from senior leaders to convince them that this preventative approach must be at the top of the list?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are already some pieces of work that I think it is helpful to point to. The Farmer report, I think, is helpful in this respect. And the Farmer report indicates that one of the things it indicates, which I think is helpful for some people to understand, and that's almost to put a sort of monetary value on what this is doing for your organization. So some people might not be as persuaded by the it's just a good thing to look after our employees' mental health. some people need some hard facts to say, look, not only is this a good thing because mental ill health is awful for the person suffering and that it's awful for the person who's close to the person who's suffering, but it's also costing our organization a lot of money. And there's some very interesting information in the Farmer-Stevenson report that talks about how you can calculate the cost per employee. I actually think the costs are calculated rather differently in a professional services organization. And I've tried to do some sort of some very basic calculations. And I think that mental ill health is costing HSF, for example, around £25 million a year. So for those that don't necessarily buy in to this is just a good thing to do to look after people, but this is costing us a lot of money. So is it worth investing? So the one thing I think we can do is to talk about potentially the cost of it. I prefer to focus on the human importance rather than the cost importance. And on that front, there's a very helpful piece of research done by Accenture. And Accenture did something with an organization called This Can Happen, which is a charity, and they produced a piece of research into workplace mental health in which they were able to show that organizations that were more open, that were more supportive, that were more understanding about the challenges of mental ill health tended to do better than organizations that dismissed it. And so that's another thing that I would want to take to senior management to say, look, please read this report. Please read the Farmer-Stevenson report if you want some further background information as to why this should make a big difference. I think the third category that I always point out is I was very fortunate to be introduced to a very eminent professor called Professor Sir Graham Thornycroft, who is one of the world's experts on stigma. And what Graham was able to show was that the best way to reduce stigma in mental ill health was to have somebody who had struggled, so somebody like me who's had some lived experience, that they can stand up in front of an organization and talk about their own experiences. And what that does is it helps to normalize the conversation. It helps to show that there are people within the organization that have struggled and that are currently in a good place. As soon as you start reducing stigma, you have then people talking about it. As soon as you've got people talking about it, there's something about sharing something that takes the power away from it. If you think you're the only person struggling with depression or stress and anxiety, you don't talk about it, you close up, and it feels like the burdens of the world are on you. But if you are within an organization which encourages you to be confident in being vulnerable, then somehow the power of that stress, that anxiety, OCD, whatever it might be, starts to be taken away from you. And it's the beginning of a journey in which we can start to get better. It's the beginning of a journey in which an organization can create an environment where actually this stuff is common, this stuff is awful, let's talk about it, and let's help people as best we can in just the same way we would want to help people with a physical illness.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much for those recommendations, Chris, and also the reports that I'm sure will be useful for people to read and reference, and we will include links to those in our show notes. So, Chris, you mentioned earlier your head of diversity and inclusion and how they approached you a few years ago to work together. And in question 4, we like to hone in on equity and inclusion. And of course, the topics you've covered are so heavily related to that. May I ask how you've best used your position, perhaps in working with your head of diversity and inclusion, to bring about change in ways that are delivering your business goals?
Yeah, look, well, the very specific point came about where our then head of diversity back in 2015 was really proactive in terms of wanting to make a big difference in the mental health front. And I think he recognized that to have somebody senior within the organization, to have a partner speak out about their challenges. And in fact, actually, it wasn't just me, it was also a female partner as well that he approached to say, would you be willing to tell your story, in short? And so, that was a big step, actually, on the basis that nobody had recorded a This Is Me video before. So the fact that he was happy to approach us and ask whether we would be willing to do that, I felt made a really significant change to the organization. And interestingly, one of the problems that I then encountered was people said to me, it's all right for you, Chris, because you're senior and the other female partner was also senior. So you were well established within the organization. So maybe it was easier for you to share your story without being concerned about job security, etc. And what I've been really pleased to see within HSF is that since that time, and in a number of offices around our global network, we have seen now people in business services, associate solicitors, junior solicitors, and even trainee solicitors coming forward to share their stories. And a lot of that is very much driven by the D&I team. And we've got a really fabulous team across our network, primarily based in London and Australia, but there are champions, mental health champions, in I would say probably all of our offices. And for me, it felt different having somebody much more junior, because what it said to me was that we were starting to create an environment in which somebody felt safe to share their story, and where somebody thought, you know what, this is an organization that takes this stuff seriously and is not going to impact my career. And that seemed a really, really significant moment. And indeed, I'm aware of at least one partner who's gone through to partnership in the last few years, who has historically struggled with mental health issues, depression and similar, all of which was known to the partnership. And yet they were still promoted, which again was just a really fantastic moment. That not only were we an organization that encouraged the discussion, but we recognized that this was something common, and that just because somebody had struggled with a mental health issue should not preclude them from being promoted within the organization.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear, Chris. And I was wondering if, subsequent to you and the female partner that you mentioned as senior leaders sharing your own stories, in creating that safe culture and the successes that you've seen in recent years, what were the maybe one or two other things that you and the D&I teams did that have contributed to the culture you've created?
Yeah, well, look, I think it's probably a whole package of things, actually. One of the things, and I take no credit for this, I mean, really my role has been in supporting the D&I team throughout the firm, and the leadership of the mental health space has been very much driven by them, which is as it should be. So there's really been a package of things, one of which is that we've not just focused on mental health, we've focused on a whole broad range of things, all of which go to people feeling good about themselves, good at work, good at home, etc. So that might be physical health, it might be financial health, it might be, I'm a working parent. How do we make life better for them? How do we make it easier for them? What support can we put around them? It may be that I'm supporting an aging parent or relative. How can we put structures in place that would enable me both to support the aging relative and continue with my career? So there are a whole bunch of things. I think a number of organizations have put in place mental health first aiders. So people who have a half day or a full day training and are willing to have their names put on the intranet within the firm. And I'm pretty sure that we've got somebody in every single office. And if I were just to look at London, we've probably got 100 people. If I were to click on our intranet under mental health, I would be able to see 100 people who are really interested in this area and will be happy for anybody to contact them. And again, that's something that's been driven by the D&I team. And the other thing I think I would mention specifically is a number of organizations, I think the more enlightened ones, have been conducting more online surveys. And what's been interesting is that whilst I think employees get a bit bored of surveys generally, if it's a survey that goes directly to how they're feeling, a survey that directly impacts their mental health, they seem to be very happy to report back how they're feeling within that week or that month. And then the critical piece is that staff then need to see that things are then actioned. Because what you can't have is just a series of surveys that indicate there are particular pressure points within the organization and that those aren't then being actioned. So you need to have the survey, you need to see the results, you need to see what action's being taken, and then you need to follow up to see whether the intervention is having the desired impact.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for those examples, Chris. Really practical ways that other D&I teams can learn from you and continue to build their own programs for their own companies. And on the theme of practical examples that others can implement, our last question is often the hardest, I think, because we do like to be specific and ask you, what is one thing that you would like to see all HR leaders, all leaders, working on people-related matters, what specific thing would you like to see them do to make a positive change for the world?
Yeah, look, you're right. It's a short question and it's very specific. I think the key to a lot of this is for leaders, and whether you're in charge of 6,000 people or you're in charge of one person, is the importance of building a deep personal relationship with them. And to connect with them in a meaningful way, because it's only if you do that that you can then take steps to address potential issues that come up. Because unless you've got the sort of relationship in which somebody feels safe and comfortable with raising a particular issue with you, or you've created that environment within the organization, you're never going to be able to get to the heart of what might be troubling that individual. So I think the key message that I would share would be to form a deep relationship, a deep connection, and be willing to be vulnerable, because it's only once you are willing to be vulnerable that you give permission to other people to share what might be troubling them at a particular time.
Thank you, Chris. And I suppose in addition to being brave in that vulnerability, how that comes about is through time and ensuring that time is allocated for the relationships to form and build.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for leaving us with that thought, Chris, and for all your honesty in your own braveness and sharing the vulnerabilities in your own experience. They're very much appreciated, as well as all the really useful examples that you shared today that I know our listeners are going to find very interesting and I'm sure act on too. So thank you again for joining us on How HR Leaders Change the World.
Great. Thank you, Cecilia. It's been my pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of How HR Leaders Change the World. Thank you for tuning in. If you have a moment to leave a review, a 5-star one please, that would be a huge help to achieving our goal to reach more of your peers, so we can all contribute to further and faster positive change. For your copy of the show notes, head to frombabieswithlove.org, where you can also join the How HR Leaders Change the World mailing list, and make sure you don't miss out on future episodes and bonus materials. And for harnessing the power of your role to create positive social change, I'm sending you a jumping up in the air virtual high five. See you next time on How HR Leaders Change the World.